The theme of this series is to disrupt the certainty that I observe people have around these topics, but with the purpose of gaining clarity. And to gain clarity, one often has to disrupt the sense of certainty. And so we're here to kind of bring these topics not to completion or to be overly academic about it, but to really present places that we feel there should be more consideration and thoughtfulness around. And again, in the effort to disrupt some of our certainty and to see what kind of clarity might emerge.
And what kind of certainty in particular are we disrupting as we think about engaging in cathedral thinking?
Yeah, in this topic, it's more about disrupting our idea of myopia. The idea to be a myopic thinker is what we're taught in our culture and society, which is to be short term, to see things very much in the immediate future within the next quarter or the next, at the most, 5 years before we need to see significant returns or to try to sell a company or whatever. So myopic thinking is a big part of our conditioning, and cathedral thinking is opposite of that. Also, speed is another area of conditioning that our society has. Short-term thinking versus long-term thinking. Also, finite thinking versus infinite thinking. And there's finite strategies and there's more infinite strategies, and these are not my ideas, but these are things that have been discussed. And so these are the areas where cathedral thinking disrupts some of our social conditioning, both in our work and in our lives. How can we approach our work and our projects and our existences beyond the self, beyond an immediate reward? Not saying that we want to limit a reward. I believe in rewarding ourselves and each other in our lifetime, in this lifetime. But is it possible to do both? And that's what cathedral thinking is bringing to the forefront.
I'm thinking about the periods of time that I'm wired to think in, kind of from shortest to longest, just to put these on display. So the shortest would be like, what am I having for dinner? And then maybe to expand that a little bit, it'd be like, am I able to work out, move my body 3 or 4 times this week? And then a little bit broader would be, I need to, assemble a few weeks together to make sure I'm not traveling too much in the month of May. And then, the easy ones are the projects that we have OKRs, objectives and key results for in a specific quarter. And then annual performance reviews. Again, if we're in like the context of work, or calendar year, or a personal calendar year, like a birthday or anniversary. Like, what do we want to accomplish before we turn 40? Another big one that comes to mind for me are election cycles, which I'm not just talking about presidential election cycles because there's local elections, but I think these put us on different cadences that we experience a time continuum or a set of fixed measurements within time spans that are very limited. And then I suppose the longest way that I perceive or set measurements against time would be my lifetime, which we don't know when the end of that is. But when you think about legacy is probably the closest thing that we can consider in terms of thinking beyond our lifetime, i.e. cathedral thinking beyond us. And we should actually define why it's called cathedral thinking too.
Yeah, cathedral thinking is from ancient times when cathedrals were being built, and they took several lifetimes, not just a single lifetime. And so that was a part of the normal everyday life, was building cathedrals. And with this understanding and acceptance that it wasn't something that the builders would see completed or finished in their lifetime. And maybe their children wouldn't even see it finished or completed in their lifetime. So it was this commitment to participating in something beyond reward that they would experience. It was being built for future generations. And I think that's also an interesting point too that I've thought about around cathedral thinking, is the being a spectator versus a participant, how significant that is in our culture when we're really conditioned to be spectators and not participants, even though sometimes it seems like we're participating, but we're not. And I think in an obvious way is that there's an action and a commitment and a investment that isn't just to watch or to see a result, which would be the spectator, right? Is to observe in a disassociative way and to see what happens and what the result is. That's being a spectator. versus participating, where you have skin in the game and you're actually investing and you're doing something, you're actioning something. You are a builder, you're a creator. You have investment, active investment in the creation of something, and it's not limited to yourself.
Yeah, and just to underline this definition, it's potentially a lifetime of dedication to a thing that you will never see the end of. And that is actually kind of, it's thinking that's hard to even imagine us dedicating our entire life, like whether you're the architect or the builder, going to work every day in pursuit of this thing that it's not will you see the end? You know you won't see the end of it. And how does a human being dedicate themselves to something that will outlive them? I don't think that this idea exists in very many places in our current society. I think it's really virtuous.
An immediate example is that all of human decision intelligence is cathedral thinking, it's legacy thinking. It's way beyond our lifetimes. And it's something that we are very connected to in terms of that fact that this is a slow innovation, that human intelligence and our brains and our abilities and the creatures that we are forever in development because there is an infinite kind of possibility around human intelligence. How does one invest in that? How does one expand that? How does one build and grow the skills and capacities of human beings, especially when that can change contextually and over time and in different ages and different variables, right? So this is a slow, innovative process, which is cathedral thinking. It's slow innovation. It's not fast innovation. And it's more rooted and anchored in time and in presence and in a kind of credibility that's going to withstand different ages if we want to, build out this metaphor, right? These cathedrals last not, just hundreds of years, but sometimes thousands of years. And you can consider all the weather and the people going in and out and the physical elements that this has to withstand. So I think some of the biggest legacy systems are slow innovations. And also there's a kind of a system literacy where it's more complex to build something slow and big and monumental and that's going to stand the test of time. And these places tend to be more sacred. So, cathedral builders, since it was attached to people's faith and since it anchored communities, there was this sacred space. And just even metaphorically or symbolically, right? Cathedral thinking allows for something a little bit more permanent, more infinite, that's more soulful. This kind of thinking and approach tends to be a little bit more sacred, a little bit more meaningful, something that we're more invested in a soulful way.
Yeah, and I think the building practices, just to stay with this metaphor, are also different building practices. It's not prefab concrete walls that you're slapping down, it's deep foundations, just even more ancient building practices, ones that require more skilled workers,
Mhm.
artisan, craftsmen, not the building techniques of our day. I'm also thinking about someone who's going to design something that's this big. I like you use the word monumental. You have to be really deliberate and even the way you're staging resources. Like I know it's actually a basilica, but the La Sagrada Familia that's here in Barcelona, they actually had to source rocks from different quarries because the access to the resources over hundreds of years changed. And so this means there's
Mm.
slightly different colors in different parts of the exterior of the building. So when you're thinking about building something that's going to take hundreds of years to build, it's not just like you place one order for all of the exterior material. So the word deliberate comes to mind. What does one need to be able to see or envision or speculate about in the future in order to put together plans to build in a cathedral way?
Yeah, I mean, what are the long term, more soulful, legacy, lasting, monumental? What is required to build those kind of systems, structures, frameworks? One thing that really comes to mind is there's an unfinished mindset, that there's a different kind of iterative process. So even when we're building something short term creative, there's iteration, but there's also iteration in long term because of resource issues, something of a different scale or that is more complex. There has to be more room to navigate different kinds of resources that become available or disappear. And then a different kind of systems thinking because you're integrating multiple systems because it takes longer and the resources change, both individual artisans or craftsmen versus the literal materials, all the way to maybe design advancements, architectural advancements, and then what decisions have to be made along the way to withstand time. And so time becomes an actual conversation and a point of consideration that's different when you're building something to be quick and not lasting. So I think this unfinished mindset, that there's something that is never quite finished. I mean, I don't want to be overly literal about it because cathedrals did finish. But the other place that I have an example, besides building concepts and frameworks and ideas and systems into the future that are legacy that will last a long time, is in our relationships, in our personal development. There is something that is never ending. We as humans are not ever finished, and our relationships really shouldn't be either. There's an infinite quality to them that is never ending. And how does one invest in the growth and development of our relationships, and how we develop intimacy and safety and trust and bonding with each other? How do we develop our own minds, our own emotional intelligence, and the health of our bodies, which all require skills and capacity and desire to even invest and practice the things that grow us? There's something that's unlimited and unfinished and ongoing. There isn't an end. And so cathedral thinking does really index on the process, the quality of the process that's never ending. It's not about an end result, or the end result has to be equal to the quality of the process. And so that's another element of cathedral thinking, and how it personally affects us as humans, and then how certain people who are building legacy systems, or buildings or wealth or whatever it is that's going to maintain for a very long time generationally. I love that. I love it that it's unending and it's unfinished. Even with cathedrals, there's continual repair. It's not something that they just leave and let be decade after decade. It requires repair. It requires maintenance. And I like that metaphor because it's really similar to us as individuals and people, that we need to upkeep. Our bodies require maintenance, our relationships require maintenance, and they also require skill, and in an infinite, unending way.
Going back to the example of La Sagrada Familia, it was interesting because Gaudi, the original architect, only worked on it for a very short amount of his life. He died really young. And the plans were destroyed in the war. Parts of them were destroyed in the war, or they were dispersed, or they were incomplete. And so the actual original design for this basilica that we think of as this, huge church in Barcelona has iterated, just by the nature of the fact that it wasn't built in 6 months or a year or 10 years. And it's really cool to think about different systems, as you were talking about systems, and obviously technology is one of those systems we interface with. So multiple different architects came on to help envision what Gaudi's plan would have been. So that required not just architectural knowledge, but really the philosophical mindset of the way he was designing to fill in the holes. And then they've also used a lot of old school architecture technology, but also they've used AI to envision and portray what the future would be. And so that is a really neat aspect, is it's actually a collaboration over many years. There are so many liabilities and vulnerabilities to building something slow, but I would say that each of those liabilities and vulnerabilities invites something new to the iterative process. And that's what it's all about. It's that it's kind of an evolving, like a living organism, instead of just being like, here are the plans, build it, it's done, move on. It gets to have a spirit, a soul, a personality of its own, as actual history interfaces with it and impacts it.
There's a kind of embodiment where there's something representative. We talk about symbol a lot. We talk about metaphor a lot. How does something represent and symbolize a value or something inspiring and beautiful, like a cathedral? How does that change over time? How does it continually to be embodied in a different way? And I do think that as things change, their form changes, and it's still a structure that's material and physical. And so there is a kind of embodiment to a cathedral or something structural like that. And then obviously for our own self, as we develop our growth and as our own expansion, that is the process of embodiment. What will we become? And that takes time. It takes humility. It takes resources. It isn't something that we can do very much alone either. So when we consider building something as monumental as a cathedral, there is absolutely no singular person that can accomplish that. And I think some of the most inspiring, sacred, symbolic places, we can't do it alone. And so there's an embedded humility in the amount of time and the human limitation, meaning like there are limitations. How do we overcome and make decisions based on those limitations, whether it's a resource or all of the different limitations that we have when we're building something and all of the different limitations that we have when we're trying to grow ourselves. I think it's really interesting.
I also think, like you say, you can't build it alone, but it's really important if this project that's bigger than you or your lifetime is going to go on, that there's other people around you equally invested and committed to carrying it on. I think that's really hard. I mean, in an individualistic society, I'm really inspired by someone that would choose to do some project that you're not going to see the end of. You're not going to have control over finishing it. I think we love to
Mm.
see projects that can be completed, like when you can clean your house and see the results. Like, why do we think in such kind of small, time boxed ways? There's a reason we want to participate in the end as well. So I'm really inspired by someone who would put plans out that it's going to take hundreds of years to build because they wouldn't even know how it would be funded. Like, who approved these plans? Who approved this building project? Who approved all of it? Someone just had the idea that they were that, I don't know, bold or innovative to dream and vision something that had never been done before. And that they probably had a lot more questions than answers about how it would get completed. But they did it anyway. So, I mean, this is the invitation, is how can we think about starting things that we don't know the end of? And we're so often conditioned that, like, oh, that's not even a good idea if you don't know how it's going to pan out. What's the ROI? Who's your target audience? These are things that we face every day in our work as we start to bring to life something that we couldn't possibly see the end of nor the full need for.
Yeah, that is an interesting thought too, is how did the decision makers justify something that was going to take generations to build and a lot of money in whatever way, like to get these resources, to get the people to make something that big happen, and a lot on a kind of faith in a way, because I'm sure the timelines were somewhat understood, but I don't know, anybody who's been involved in a building project, even in modern times, those get very extended because there's so much we can't anticipate or predict, especially in complex building projects. And I think it is just a perfect metaphor. Anything that we're building and that we're creating in society or in our families and in our careers is usually not super simple, and especially not when we're really trying to build something meaningful and soulful that's going to last. And I think that meaningful and soulful kind of mean it's lasting, something that has enough value to the world and society that it needs to be maintained and sustained. And I think that so much of our culture is interested in very quick fixes that are points of satisfying some immediate need, and which is good too. Like, I'm not saying that we're against that, but this cathedral thinking, I think, is something that is good to return to. In so many ways, we're the other extreme, the immediacy of our culture and the immediacy of our thinking, and that is something that we need to balance with cathedral thinking, that we need to have both. And in human decision intelligence, that's so much the goal, is to become more expansive processors, to become more expansive thinkers, to become more expansive humans, to where we can do more expansive things, but by adding and including more variables, more skills, more capacity, and less subtracting. And that builds our mastery in what we can accomplish.
Space seems to be an area where there is a shared value around space exploration that we don't really know exactly what the answers are. Obviously, there are goals attached to being able to sustain life on the moon as an entry point to Mars and beyond, and all of these missions that are predominantly for exploration, but with an underpinned need that the Earth won't be able to solely sustain us in the future.
Yeah, I mean, talk about cathedral thinking there. Most incredible innovations are very future thinking. That's kind of interesting with science and technology, because those are often built maybe a little too quickly, that create problems, which is something we can consider with AI. Like, is it building and accelerating at a speed that is too fast for humanity to keep up, which is exactly why we're invested in human decision intelligence, is to help humanity keep up with these innovations. So space is something that, yeah, is really, really far out. And on one hand, it's awesome because so much of the innovations that come from space exploration, we can immediately use on Earth. And that's what I love and what many people in society forget. It's not only about 40 to 140 years in the future of how that exploration might be more and more necessary to our survival. It's definitely world building. So I think that might even be beyond cathedral building. If we want to
No,
end up, making it to Mars or off our planet, I think that's maybe a different category than cathedral thinking. Yeah.
maybe some of the same ingredients are in play. The UN's SDGs, Sustainable Development Goals, I've kind of like personally bucketed them into three areas, and they do relate to ways that we need to be building practices in governments and institutions and in businesses to support development. These goals were set for 15 years. They were set in 2015 to be reached by 2030. So, still, I mean, this is probably the longest term. That's like a 15-year goal, right? That the UN is thinking 15 years in the future. Some of them are around basic human needs like food, water, sanitation. Some of them are around retooling the systems and institutions that are broken. So, education, healthcare, and even consumer production and consumption. But the third and final bucket is building the future. And this is the future of work, the future of education, the future of life below sea and above sea on land. And so I think this is the place where we get to dream a little bit and hopefully cast a vision that it's about putting the frameworks in place, not just for these 15 years, but to sustain us into the future.
Yeah, another key word that comes to mind as you're talking about that is inheritance. What are we, when we're building something for the future, there is something a little bit more personal about what is inherited by the next generations. What are we giving them? What are we providing them that is beyond ourself, that is an advantage and is helping the world to be more healthy or more beautiful? And what resources and opportunities and possibilities are we investing in for the future as their inheritance? And I think that is a different kind of framing in my mind. The idea of inheritance is a gift, not only a necessity.
And so, where is the space for cathedral thinking for an individual? Is it about their legacy? I've definitely noticed or interacted with people who reach a time in their life when all of a sudden their goals and priorities change. And it's really about like, what is the lasting mark that I want to leave on this earth? And you can feel it. And like all of the sudden, it's like, wait, where did that come into their like why is that in the plans? And it's this thing around legacy. It's like, ooh, I've only got a couple decades or a handful of years. All of a sudden the metrics change with that kind of perspective.
Yeah.
How can we incorporate more of that early in our life, but also not lose sight of the fact that there's more tangible short-term goals that we can balance with cathedral thinking?
Yeah, it's additive, not subtractive, right? It's the idea of, sure, we can do immediate short term things that are really good and beneficial for ourselves and society and our relationships. And also, we should be cathedral thinking. What are we building beyond ourselves? What are we contributing to society and the world beyond our own kingdom building, which as Americans and the capitalistic systems are way over indexing on as our building our personal kingdoms, which is not bad. But how can we do both? And if we have to sacrifice, can we evaluate the costs and benefits in a more sophisticated, lasting, meaningful, soulful way?
Yeah, when you brought relationships into the conversation earlier, I mean, that's really where we're going to experience the greatest opportunity to apply cathedral thinking and see how it changes in a tangible way in our lifetime, because our relationships are potentially our longest standing experience, right? Like jobs change, wealth changes, locations change, but your children are your children. So that's the place to be considering and choosing cathedral like strategies in the way that you build these relationships. But what does maintenance look like? I think it looks like making decisions differently, knowing that you want to preserve or protect or usher the relationship into a new phase over decades and decades and decades of time.
100%. I mean, this is what so much of my personal priorities are to make the parallel between whatever we're doing in the external world and whatever we're building and committed to in terms of creating something can be applied to our relationships and how interesting those applications are. Because if we consider parenting and how difficult parenting is, that our moments of exhaustion around parenting will give something immediate to get peace or relief. And that those things oftentimes over time will make the relationship more strained, and it won't be as resilient or as self repairing, or there won't be as much trust, or there won't be as much skills because we've defrayed too much of our stress to get to more simple places of ease and comfort. And so, yeah, it's the same practices as can we look at our relationships and examine what is really required to have the most healthy, sustainable relationships that fundamentally nurture us and keep us vital and connect us to our own humanity in ways that are sacred and necessary, I would argue. And as society develops, and maybe it's always been this way, but I think more than ever, our technology is causing atrophy for some of the skills, but humans have probably always struggled to invest in building skills and building capacity, particularly in the face of survival, right? So this isn't a judgment of any of us doing the minimum in our relationships if we don't have the resources, the internal and external resources to invest, but there is a cost to that too. And so that is what a lot of human decision intelligence is about, is evaluating, oh, there are certain decisions that we make and priorities and values that we have that are tied to the lack of resources, internal and external resources. And yet those actually are increasing pain, that we're not actually helping ourselves, even though we don't have some of the things that we feel like we need in order to invest and to create stronger relationships for ourselves. There's a cost to having weak relationships. There's a cost to having unhealthy relationships that actually increase our depletion, that are more self-sabotaging, and increase our suffering. So in this world and in the realities that exist, we have to learn how to do multiple things. We have to learn skills and capacities so that we can actually survive, but it's beyond our immediate pain points. And so this is the consideration and the questions that we're asking, that I think without asking, we just go into habit, and we're not recognizing how much pain we're adding to our own lives and to the lives around us, honestly. So it's all the same work, whether we're looking at building a business and growing a business or building a relationship and growing a relationship. The skills are very, very similar and sometimes identical.
You used the word devotion earlier to think about like how do you stay so committed to an idea that you won't necessarily have control of or even see the end of. And I would say as you talk about this relational space that there is a discipline where like the parent parenting the child where it's like, man, I'm exhausted. I want to give in, but I have a discipline because I am devoted to this child and to bringing them up. I'm going to discipline our interactions or what I give them or how I relate to them for their future. And I also think about a single mom really struggling to make ends meet financially, tucking away 20 or 40 bucks a month that she doesn't have for the kids' college education. There's some kind of investment in the future that is incurring a short term cost in order to have a long term benefit. And so often we talk about this all the time how our anxiety in a moment ejects us from this kind of longer term or this cathedral thinking just so that we can meet the needs of that moment, which is understandable for humans. This is an invitation to start with awareness of when that's happening. And then I also think about the long-term example of someone who's retired or they're in their 80s and they look around and they don't have any relationships because it was so clear kind of where their cathedral was being built. And once there's an ending to professional engagement, if they haven't been building relationships in a cathedral way, they look around and that's not something you can easily earn back, right? It's something that has to have constant dedication, devotion, and discipline around over the years.
Yeah. And personal growth is requires the same discipline and devotion, never mind to building relationships with our children, our family, our friends, our communities, but even to grow out of our own fears and our own self-sabotaging habits. There requires a capacity and a kind of devotion to not eject, to have unconscious safety in a way that actually just increases our lack of safety because we're not building the new pathways in our bodies to hold good experiences that feel dangerous but actually aren't, right? And so I'm sure there's some parallel there in building a cathedral where all of these artisans and craftsmen had to work through, their moments of probably despair. And I can imagine all kinds of fears that would creep up in their lifetime commitments to building something that they couldn't see, and also allowing their children to engage in these same kind of commitments and devotion. But one thing I did want to say, that as you were speaking, that I thought was an interesting abstract kind of metaphor, is if we think of epigenetics. Like if we actually think of, extrapolating beyond the immediate inheritance of the next generation, that is very visible, right? We can see the next generation around us. We can see younger people, but within our own families, thinking about cathedral thinking and what kind of inheritance that we leave for multiple generations, where we have a genetic and emotional imprint on them. So as a parent in that moment, and I've thought of this with my nieces and nephews since I'm not a parent, but what kind of gift can I give my nieces and nephews so that their great grandchildren don't have to suffer from some of the wounds or maladaptions that they might have right now? And can I be a resource to my family and friends that isn't just limited to their health and the immediate relationship that I have with them, but to many generations down the line, where there is this kind of epigenetic trail? I mean, we have an ancestral connection, and what kind of pains do we inherit or limitations do we inherit that we could be thinking of now and to prevent or to gift along the way?
I love it. But because it leads me to the question is like, what is the source? What is the thing inside you, inside your brain, inside your heart, inside who you are that makes you interested in that? Because not everyone is.
Yeah. What are the forces around us, visible and invisible, that fundamentally affect our humanity in positive ways and in negative ways? And most humans walk through this world not looking at those things or examining those things and being happily ignorant, which I do not judge. However, that again, like I said, typically an unexamined life is a life where the suffering is increased because there isn't enough growth to create increased intelligence and mastery and skills and capacity to continue to invest in themselves and in their relationships on the things that fundamentally make humans fulfilled. And I'm not saying that, an unexamined life has no fulfillment, but I do think that there's a lot of consequences and costs that are invisible. And so for me personally, part of being a responsible human is to really examine that so that I can hold myself responsible for the things that I'm unintentionally and unconsciously perpetuating, particularly in the negative ways. But I also want to be connected to the things that I'm perpetuating in positive ways so that I can own that too. And I think it's just that society and people in some ways are fragile. And we need each other, and we need all the advantages that we can fucking get. And so why not give that energy and examination when really it only helps us to become more masterful and increasing our capacities and skills to be more fulfilled, healthy humans, and to have more fulfilling relationships and to create in more fabulous, lasting ways, which I think is a gift, a kind of birthright of being a human, is to create. Whether we're literally creating children or we're creating projects and art and beauty and relationships, all of that is the creative process, all of it. And I think that is the beautiful part of our humanity that does require investment, that does require attention, that is a sacred space that is worth our examination and is worth our effort and energy.
It's funny because you're talking about this like beautiful thing in this beautiful way. And I'm sitting here thinking, oh, like taking a carbon emissions impact test. You can do those quizzes online to see like, how much am I contributing to global warming and climate change? And how can I adjust my processes by bringing in awareness to how many lights I have on and what are my modes of transportation and where do I source my clothing from and where do I source my food from? And maybe we can use this metaphorically to think about the impacts that we're having on a much larger scale, that it's not just about our individual experience, it's how our individual experiences are tied to one another in the collective and how on a collective level it does matter. And there is a difference that we can make.
Many people who are listening get overwhelmed. I know many people who are very overwhelmed by the endless areas that need to be considered and examined. And I would say that for myself, where I can have the perspective that makes it less overwhelming is that it's all the same skill. So, this ability to process information and examine and have a kind of analytics, once there's a certain level of mastery around it, it becomes quite easy. And it's the same thing that we're applying. It's the same kind of intelligence that we're applying to different landscapes, to different domains, to different disciplines. And so it's not that difficult. It's like when you're a fabulous mathematician, it's just numbers. They're everywhere. And you just understand numbers. And so you're able to make those calculations with a lot of ease and not so much friction in general. And then, yeah, as we grow and we're developing, okay, there's always friction a little bit in our growth. But for me, what I've noticed is that it doesn't actually require me as much effort and energy as it does when we're learning, because the skills are identical, just applied in a different way. And so that remains an encouragement to me, because when I list it out with words, all of the areas that need attention in one's life, it's so overwhelming. And I think that is one of the biggest obstacles. If we're talking about, what gets in the way and obstacles, I think so much of what gets in the way is our experience of overwhelm. Where do we start? How do we start? How, inside my anxiety and my current limitation of lack of skills and lack of capacity, how do I even want to make things better when I just don't even have desire? This is why we're doing our work with human decision intelligence, is to help people know where to start and to be that support along the way. And like when we're learning anything, how to cook, there's a learning curve. But once we get to a certain place, it's way less overwhelming, and we can see the interconnectedness of everything. And so there's a lot more ease inside an increased ability.
Cooking's a great example because for me, I started with recipes, but then once I learned how all the flavors go together and the composition of a dish and the ingredients necessary, meaning like the flavor profiles that need to be in balance, then all of a sudden, oh, I've gained a kind of mastery in how things come together. So now I can open the fridge and I can throw anything together because you've gained the skill of cooking. You've mastered the composition of cooking. So we've talked about how cathedral thinking ties into like innovation and the iterative process. And I'm curious, we talk a lot about future proofing our lives and our relationships and our decisions. How does cathedral thinking fit into making future proofed decisions?
The process of cathedral thinking forces both a fast and slow data analysis. And that is the best way that we are preventative, is that we're looking both zoomed in and zoomed out. We're looking at both right now in the next quarter, and we're also looking at the next 5 years and the next 10 years, and in some instances beyond, right? And that is the point. That is the most preventative approach one could have, is when we're considering all of the variables in a more expansive landscape, so that we can make more intelligent decisions both now and for the future. And we can weigh those costs out, because we're actually using variables that people aren't using when they're only thinking short term. They're not actually including the data of the long term. And that's actually how and why so many bad decisions are made, is because they're not calculating it further out in the timeline. And then what happens is, when one doesn't do that, the costs are so much greater. They've made such a decision in the present that seemed really efficient and great, but it just costs them now 10 times in the future as it would if they just made a different decision. And so I think it's the ultimate future proofing, just human decision intelligence in general, and any of these landscapes and topics. That's why we're including them, is to have these as points of consideration, so that we can include them in our analysis and in our decision making. And if they become a habit, we don't even need to include it, because we're automatically embodying these landscapes.
Yeah, like one of the skills connected to this topic is existential math. Existential math is one of the core skills in the pedagogy for learning human decision intelligence. And the way that it fits in is, how can we weigh our values and non literal realities, like a cathedral being built well after my lifetime has ended, and how can we factor that in to our present decision? to like the actual tangible resources and plans and building process and procurement, all of those things. And this is where there's new intersections, there's new data to work with. We talk about disruption leading not to certainty, but to clarity. And so that doesn't give you a certain date that the cathedral will be finished, but it does give you a clarity about the priorities, the values, the pathway towards a goal that's bigger than can be imagined.
Well, and with cathedral thinking, we're constantly data collecting. So there isn't an end. And when we're available and looking to receive all the new data, which is a part of the iterative process, right? When we iterate, that's what we're doing is, oh, with this new information came in, now we make an adjustment. And I think that's something that happens more in long-term thinking is that we continue to collect data and have this present in our plans. And that makes a difference in itself is that we're not stopping the investigative process. We're not stopping collecting data. And then how that new data then intersects with a value that we have and a priority that we have. And along the way, by the way, what happens is sometimes values and priorities shift based on new circumstances. And so that's also part of the process. Which values are maintained and which priorities are maintained, or do priorities have to shift, which usually they do. And that's useful and preventative because if one is maintaining a priority that shouldn't be maintained based on new information and new data and new circumstance, that creates a whole other problem. So is the work of constant, continual, infinite engagement and developing a mastery in that way to where we can zoom in and zoom out. We can do both and to continue evaluating our limitations, our resources, and leverage our intelligences and to see things different and to change our perspective, right? All of it is a certain level of mastery that really is invoked inside cathedral thinking.
I think this is the greatest area of humility is to stay unfixed, to not say like, no, these are my plans or these are my values and I'm just going to stick with them regardless of what new intel comes in, or to the extent that I'm unwilling to see new realities, new facts and data because I'm so committed, so devoted to the plan. And so we started the conversation talking about how speed, short-term thinking, myopic thinking, and this kind of finite thinking is where we've kind of had a social erosion, and that all those things are necessary to be present, but only in the balance of their opposites, where there's a slow kind of building that fosters different kinds of building processes. There's a long-term thinking. Maybe it's not, hundreds of years, but maybe it's a little bit longer than we're currently thinking, right?
Right.
And then the infinite thinking, where new possibilities reveal themselves as you engage in this process of data collection and evolving, being less committed to fixed priorities.
Yeah, there's something that's unfinished that as people and as teams that it's okay for a certain places to remain unfinished or incomplete. That's a part of the ethos of cathedral thinking as well. And that is a gesture towards growth and towards a consistent energy and attention towards elevating and developing. So I think that unfinished part is pretty poetic. And I don't mean it to be always literal, but there is this place where there's a devotion to the process more or equal to an outcome. And that is what human decision intelligence is fundamentally focused on. And the power of true intelligence is inside the process. And we see this in artisans and craftsmen, and we see this in innovation, that it's really the quality of our processing and how sophisticated and masterful we can be, because that will fundamentally change the quality of the outcome and what the outcome ends up being entirely.